The streets of South Los Angeles carry countless stories of loyalty, betrayal, and conflict, one of the most infamous being the rivalry between the Neighborhood Crips and the '83 Gangster Crips. These two crews, once united by a bond of brotherhood, found themselves on opposite sides of a brutal feud that would leave a permanent mark on LA's gang history. But how did it all start? And what turned allies into bitter enemies? This is the story of the rivalry between the Neighborhood Crips and the '83 Gangster Crips. The '83 Gangster Crips, better known as the 8 Trey, are one of the most notorious African-American gangs from the west side of South Los Angeles. They emerged in the mid-1970s when Rayford Big Sidewinder Miles broke away from the original West Side Crips, led by Stanley Tookie Williams, to create something of his own. With the help of key figures like Big Bay, Hunchy, Skull, and Hillbilly, Sidewinder shaped the gang's identity. The name 8 Trey came about when Skull got locked up, and Sidewinder chose to honor 83rd Street, their home turf. Starting small around 83rd Street, the 8 Treys didn't stay quiet for long. They spread fast, locking down over 40 blocks from Western to Vermont avenues. Their reach rivaled the old West Side Crips, and they even expanded beyond Western Avenue into spots near St. Andrews Park. As the gang grew, they split into smaller groups like the original South Side and Deep South Side, keeping their grip on South LA. The 8 Treys were about making money, but their hustle was far from clean. They got deep into illegal activities, building power and a dangerous reputation. By the time the 1980s hit, they had over 300 members and were labeled one of the most violent gangs in LA. Representing the Treys within the Gangster Crips, they rocked Texas Rangers and Texas Longhorns baseball caps, with the bold T marking their allegiance. But their story isn't just about territory and power, it's about betrayal and war. The '83 Gangster Crips and the Rollin' 60s Crips were once tight. They fought together side by side against rival gangs. That all changed in the mid-1980s, flipping the script on Crip history. It all started in September 1979, when a young 8 Trey named Bootsy got into it with a Rollin' 60s member over a girl. Things got out of hand, and during the beef, a new 8 Trey member shot and killed Tyrone, a Rollin' 60s member. This was the spark that lit the fire. Tyrone's older brother, a Rollin' 60s member, demanded the '83 Gangster Crips hand over the shooter to settle things and avoid a war. But the shooter had already gone to the police, leaving the '83s empty-handed. Furious, the Rollin' 60s struck back, killing an 8 Trey member execution style, 6 shots to the face right on his porch. Leaders from both sides tried to stop the violence, but it was too late. The bloodshed didn't just continue, it exploded into one of the most infamous gang wars in LA, a war that still rages today. This beef shook the entire Crip world. Gangs had to choose sides. Some joined the Rollin' 60s as Neighborhood Crips, or Deuces, while others stood with the '83 Gangster Crips as Treys. This split was a turning point that changed gang politics in Los Angeles forever. While other rivalries like the Bloodstone Villains versus the Pueblos Bloods or the East Coast Crips against the Florence Crips have left their mark, the feud between the Rollin' 60s and the '83 Gangster Crips stands out. It's not just history, it's a war that shaped LA's streets and continues to fuel the larger battle between the Neighborhood Crips and the Gangster Crips. Sanyika Shakur, better known as Monster Cody Scott, was one of the most feared members of the '83 Gangster Crips in South Central Los Angeles. His nickname, Monster, came after a brutal attack at just 13 years old, where he beat a robbery victim so severely that the man was left disfigured. Cody and his best friend were deeply involved in the gang war with the Rollin' 60s Crips, leading violent attacks and shootings. On New Year's Eve, when Cody was 17, his enemies struck back. He was ambushed and shot 5 times by members of the Rollin' 60s. Miraculously, Cody survived, possibly because he was heavily intoxicated and high on PCP, which may have prevented him from going into shock. While recovering in the hospital, Cody claimed to have haunting hallucinations of the people he had harmed, including visions of his baby daughter. His recovery took weeks, but the violence didn't stop. Cody's younger brother, Kershawn, was determined to avenge him. Then, following day, Kershawn and some younger members of the '83 Gangster Crips went on a shooting spree. Kershawn shot 2 teenagers at a party and killed another in a drive-by before being arrested and sent to juvenile detention. Meanwhile, Cody remained in danger. While he was still in the hospital, members of the Rolling 60s attempted to finish him off, but a nurse intervened and saved his life. Even after recovering, Cody's run-ins with the law continued throughout the 1980s. Another key figure in the gang during this time was Crazy Do of the 8 Tray. Known for his intelligence and leadership, he gained respect from older gang members and various 83 Gangster Crip factions. During the gang war, he proved himself by devising strategies to outsmart the Rolling 60s. His reputation grew in 1980 when he was arrested for killing a member of the Rolling 60s, although he avoided conviction. However, the following year, he and Monster Cody were arrested for robbery. Despite doubts about his involvement, Crazy D was sentenced to 5 years in prison, while Cody received 4. When Crazy D got out of prison, he became deeply involved in Los Angeles' substance trade. He didn't abandon his friends as others in the gang turned to selling substances. Instead, he taught the younger members how to navigate the trade and even supported them. His success, however, took a dark turn when he and several other 83 Gangster Crips became involved in a horrific crime. While driving around, they opened fire on a red car, killing 2 teenage girls, Jamie Finney and LaTonjia Stover. The girls were innocent victims, and the shooting was a case of mistaken identity. The gang members were actually targeting a woman in a similar car who had sold them fake crack for $14,000. Afterward, the gang also kidnapped a woman involved in the fake crack deal, subjecting her to assault and beatings before forcing her to call her brother and demand the $14,000. Her brother contacted the police, leading them to a house on Vermont Avenue where the gang members were arrested. Big Crazy Do and several others were arrested, found guilty of murder, and sentenced to life in prison. In 1992, when the cops who beat Rodney King got off without charges, it set the streets of South Central LA on fire. The anger was real, and the 83 Gangster Crips brought that rage straight to the front lines. One of the most unforgettable moments came when they yanked a white truck driver, Reginald Denny, out of his rig and beat him down in broad daylight. Helicopters caught the whole thing live on TV, showing the world the chaos erupting in LA. The footage was raw, Denny getting stomped, hit in the face with a brick, and robbed of his wallet while he lay there unconscious. It was a brutal moment that made headlines and put the 83 Gangster Crips at the center of the 1992 LA riots. During the riots, one of their most notorious members, Trinan Lee Jefferson, better known as Psycho, made his presence known. Psycho ambushed 3 cops on Manchester Avenue, wounding all of them in the attack. But his actions came with a price. Psycho was shot in the head during the chaos and later handed a 19-year prison sentence for attempted murder. The 83 Gangster Crips were tight with other Gangster Crip sets, rolling strong with crews like the Avalon Gangster Crips, Main Street Mafia Crips, and even some members of the Hoover Criminals. But their biggest enemy? The Rolling 60s Crips. The beef was so intense that the 83s even teamed up with their old rivals, the Inglewood family, just to go at the 60s. And this feud, it wasn't just a flash in the pan, it raged on for years. On December 13, 2001, Jeremy Baycott was driving his Mustang with his friend Cochise Wilson riding in the passenger seat. As they reached a stop sign, they got into an argument with another man named Wilbert Smith. After the confrontation, as they drove away, Wilson pulled out a gun and shot Smith twice. Fortunately, Smith survived the attack. Later that night, around 11 p.m., another shooting occurred. Guion Revels was gunned down in front of a house on South Hobart Street. Witnesses reported seeing a Mustang speeding away from the scene. Wilson admitted to being a member of the 83 Gangster Crips, and Baycott was also identified as part of the gang. An LAPD gang expert explained that both shootings were acts of retaliation for a previous shooting that targeted them earlier. Baycott and Wilson were charged with attempting to kill Smith and with murdering Revels. The charges also stated that these crimes were gang-related and committed to benefit their gang. It was further alleged that Wilson was the one who pulled the trigger and caused serious injuries to the victims. The jury found both Baycott and Wilson guilty on all counts and determined the additional gang-related charges to be true. The court sentenced them to life in prison without parole for the murder. But just 2 years later, another shooting would expose even deeper gang rivalries. On August 12, 2003, around 7:40 p.m., 3 guys named Henrico, Douglas, and James were filling up their car at a gas station. This gas station was in the territory of the 83 Gangster Crips. who were enemies with the Rollin' 90s Crips. James was wearing a jersey that was popular with the 83 Gangster Crips, even though he wasn't actually in the gang. Jones was driving his black Ford Escort when his passenger yelled out the window, "This is 90s!" It was basically a way of claiming their territory for their gang. Henrico, Watson, and James got into their Chevy Nova and started driving. When they got to the corner of Western and Florence, another car pulled up alongside them. The guy in the other car flashed some gang signs and then opened fire on their car, firing 13 shots. To get away from the gunfire, Henrico had to drive into oncoming traffic. He crashed into another car, but luckily he was able to turn onto Florence Street. Watson, the passenger, was shot in the head and died. Another driver, Kenneth, who was also trying to turn onto the street, was shot in the shoulder. Luckily, Henrico, James, and Kenneth survived the shooting. Early in the morning of August 16, 2003, two detectives sat down with Jones at the police station. They talked to him for about 2 hours, trying to piece together what had happened. Right from the start, they asked Jones why he thought he was there. Jones explained that the police had shown up at his house and told him he needed to come in and answer some questions. The detectives didn't waste any time. They told Jones this was his one chance to come clean and warned him that lying would only make things worse. After making it clear how serious the situation was, they read him his rights and Jones said he understood. They pushed hard, telling Jones that his story better line up with what they already knew. To add pressure, they lied, saying they had video of his car near the gas station at the time of the shooting. They even claimed that witnesses had seen his car there, all to shake him up. When they asked if he had been driving the car used in the shooting, Jones denied it. The detectives pressed him, urging him to stop lying if he really wasn't involved. They warned him that failing to cooperate would lead to serious consequences. The pressure kept building. The detectives used scare tactics, telling Jones he was in a critical situation and needed to figure out how to save himself. They made it clear that he was looking at a very long sentence unless he decided to cooperate. They tried to convince him it would be better to admit some involvement. They suggested that if he confessed to being the driver, it wouldn't be as bad since he wasn't the shooter. They emphasized that the shooter was the one in real trouble, while Jones could avoid harsher consequences by telling the truth. They even said they'd write a favorable report for him if he came clean. They painted a picture where he had two options: either take full responsibility for everything or admit he was there but didn't know what was going to happen. Eventually, Jones broke under the pressure and admitted he was driving the car during the shooting. He told them a man with a gun had jumped into his car and forced him to drive. Scared, Jones said he did as he was told. Jones gave the detectives a description of the gunman, saying he was an African-American man wearing a white t-shirt with a small afro. After the interview, the police let Jones go. Then 2 months later, on the evening of October 19, 2003, at around 8:30 p.m., two detectives sat down with Jones again for another interview. They started by reading him his rights and letting him know he was under arrest. Jones acknowledged that he understood. During their conversation, Jones admitted he owned a black 1995 Ford Escort. Detective Jolivet didn't hold back. He told Jones he was under arrest for murder and wouldn't be going home. He reminded Jones of their previous interview and accused him of not being truthful. Jolivet urged him to come clean, warning that this was his chance to explain what happened, but he made no promises. Jones repeatedly denied being at the scene of the shooting, but Jolivet pushed back, saying he had evidence to the contrary. Jolivet asked if Jones was claiming he hadn't been carjacked, and at that point, Jones admitted he was there. He claimed that a stranger armed with a gun had jumped into his car and forced him to drive. According to Jones, the man was angry and talked about being beaten up by some guys. They drove to an intersection and the man started shooting. After the shooting, the man got out of the car and walked away. Jones said he didn't tell the police earlier because the man hadn't harmed him, but the detectives didn't believe his story. During the trial, the jury heard an audio recording of Jones's police interview. Certain parts of the recording and its written transcript had been redacted. This included specific page numbers, personal information about Jones, and irrelevant comments made by the detectives. The detectives' disbelief in Jones's story came through clearly in the interview, and the jury heard it for themselves. In the end, Jones was found guilty of murder, attempted murder, and several other gun-related charges. He was sentenced to a total of 75 years to life in prison. And the chaos didn't stop there. one afternoon in 2005 would bring more bloodshed. On May 19, 2005, Brooks was hanging out at a house with some friends, including his buddy Mike DePillars. DePillars, who went by the nickname Catchy Blue, was in a wheelchair and sitting outside. While Brooks claimed he wasn't in a gang, he often spent time with people who were, and DePillars was part of the Rolling 60s Crips. That afternoon, around 3:40, Brooks was sitting on the porch when a green Chevy pulled up. Inside were two men who started talking to DePillars. Suddenly, one of the guys in the car shouted, "Hey, Trey Hoover!" Then the man in the passenger seat pulled out a gun and fired multiple shots. One of the bullets hit Brooks in the leg, but DePillars managed to escape unharmed. Brooks recognized the driver right away. He knew him as Nash, also called Little Ant, a member of the 8 Trey Gangster Crips. When the police arrived, Brooks told them it was Little Ant from the 8 Trey gangsters who had been driving the car. Even as he was being taken to the hospital in the ambulance, he repeated to the detective that it was Little Ant from the 8 Trey gangsters. Later at the hospital, the police showed Brooks some photos to confirm the identity of the driver. Brooks picked out Nash's picture immediately. He explained that about a year earlier, Nash and some of his friends had tried to jump him, and his friend had told him Nash's name was Little Ant from the ETG gang. Brooks said he was certain because he saw the same guy driving the same car when he was shot. That same day, Officer Rich and his partner were called to a house on West 73rd Street. Someone told Officer Rich the driver of the car they were looking for was Nash, a known member of the 8 Trey Gangster Crips. Officer Rich was already familiar with Nash. He had met him a few times before, and Nash had openly admitted to being in the 8 Trey Gangsters, even sharing his gang nickname. Rich had also seen Nash driving a Chevy Monte Carlo and hanging out in areas frequented by the gang. Meanwhile, Officer Algren, who knew the Rolling 60s Crips well, explained that their gang had a massive presence in South Central Los Angeles with thousands of members. The house where the shooting happened was right in their territory, a place Algren had visited many times. He had talked to Rolling 60s members there and had even assisted in arrests for gun-related crimes. Algren pointed out the deep rivalry between the Rolling 60s and the 83 Gangster Crips. He described it as an ongoing war, where members of each gang were expected to shoot their rivals on sight. Algren was also familiar with DePillars and had met him around 20 to 30 times at various gang hangouts. DePillars had admitted to being a member of the Rolling 60s. Based on where Brooks was spending time, who he was associating with, and the clothes he was wearing, Algren believed Brooks was also connected to the Rolling 60s. He mentioned that Brooks often wore clothing associated with the gang, like a powder blue shirt, matching shoes, and a New York Yankees hat. Officer Mendoza, an expert on the 83 Gangster Crips, confirmed the gang's reputation for being extremely violent and territorial. Mendoza had spoken to many gang members and had investigated numerous crimes involving the 8 Trey gangsters and their long-standing feud with the Rolling 60s. He explained that gang members gained status and respect by eliminating their rivals, with murder being seen as the ultimate show of power within their group. Mendoza had also spoken with Nash several times before the shooting. Nash had identified himself as part of the 8 Trey gangsters and had the tattoos, clothing, and attitude to back it up. Mendoza had even seen Nash driving a green car on a few occasions, and during one traffic stop, Nash again confirmed his gang affiliation. Based on their interactions and the evidence, Mendoza was convinced Nash was deeply involved in the gang. Mendoza believed the shooting was gang-motivated. He explained that members of one gang often enter rival territory to attack as a way of asserting dominance. This kind of violence is meant to strike fear into their enemies while boosting the shooter's reputation within their gang. It's also a way to maintain control over their territory. In the end, Nash was sentenced to life in prison, though with the possibility of parole. He was convicted of deliberately trying to murder Brooks. After Nipsey Hussle was killed in 2019, something unexpected happened. Members from both sides came together for the first time in 40 years. However, there's still no peace between these two groups, but if they ever found a way to end the violence, it would be truly monumental. Appreciate you watching. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more.